Good morning and welcome, and thank you for braving the rain to come out here today. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second in a series on international religious freedom policy. Its origins, something we looked at I guess back in February in our first symposium. Today we'll be looking back at what's happened since the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, and then we'll be convening again in October, really with more of a look to the future and the new administration and how this policy is and might develop into the future. Just a word about the Berkeley Center. The center was founded 2 years ago now in the Office of the President here at Georgetown as part of a university-wide effort to advance the interdisciplinary study of religion and promote interreligious understanding. So the idea is to look at religion not in isolation, but look at really how it intersects with cultural, social, and political life across disciplines, but also with respect to the policy world, to look at religion in all of its complexity. And I think you'll agree that the issue of religious freedom, what it means, how to promote it, is indeed a very complex area, and one of the purposes of our symposium is to explore it in its multiple facets, to get beyond, or maybe better beneath, some of the polemics that often surround the issue and to arrive at some practical conclusions about where things should be moving in the future. Religious freedom, as we'll hear today, poses all kinds of challenges for U.S. policymakers. It's a universal value, universally recognized, understood in different ways in different parts of the world. Poses the challenge of balancing in practice, balancing, for example, the pursuit of an ideal against the traditional concerns of diplomacy with its norms of respect for sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states. It involves a balance, how to combine support for the rights of individuals to choose and practice their religion with the rights of groups to maintain and nourish their own cultural and religious heritage. These are broad, abstract questions, the stuff of term papers and long volumes, but also real problems for policymakers engaged in these balancing acts on the ground in this city and around the world over the last 10 years, in particular, the focus of our symposium today. I'd like to mention at the outset that this whole series is the brainchild of my colleague Tom Farr, our Luce SFS visiting professor of religion and international affairs. Tom is, I think, known to many of you. He's there in the back of the room. He'll be moderating two of our panels. He's really a leading expert, if not the leading expert, on U.S. policy in this area, and it's been great to have him here as part of the center. You will have noticed that this is a very collaborative effort, and I think exemplary in that respect. Our partner in co-organizing this series is the Council on Faith and International Affairs at the Institute for Global Engagement, a leader in this area. And I'd like to take this opportunity to also acknowledge other co-sponsors of the series: the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University, the Council for America's First Freedom, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the Religious Liberties Practice Group of the Federalist Society, the Leonard Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life, and the Council on Foreign Relations. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I look forward to an engaging, extended conversation today, and I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Chris Seiple, of the Council on Faith and International Affairs, who will be moderating our first panel.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. My name is Chris Seiple. I'm with the Council on Faith and International Affairs. I also have the privilege of being the president of the Institute for Global Engagement. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-proselytizing religious freedom organization that works for the right to choose or not choose faith freely. In the course of pursuing that vision, we have found that it's very difficult to talk about those two things you've been told not to talk about since childhood in polite company: religion and politics. And therefore, we figured we had to try to do our own thing to make the world safe to talk about religion and politics, and we founded the Council on Faith International Affairs. It's multi-faith, it's focused on scholarship, it provides a venue where scholar and practitioner can meet and partner with such organizations as the Berkeley Center and all the additional co-sponsors. Let me also say that CFIA publishes the Review of Faith International Affairs, the only journal of its kind in the field, and there are free copies back in the foyer should you want one. And while I'm extending thank yous, which I have not extended yet, let me say thanks also to Tom Farr, but also be careful to note Dr. Dennis Hoover, who has also been our partner in crime in making this happen. He is the executive director of the Council on Faith International Affairs, as well as the executive editor of the review. Our first panel this morning is a bunch of practitioners, very esteemed practitioners. To remind you, as Tom introduced, there are 3 symposia this year to mark the 10th anniversary of the International Religious Freedom Act. Our first conference in February focused on the origins of the International Religious Freedom Act. This conference focuses on practitioners, and we have asked them to provide their perspectives on how we've done so far. What's the good, the bad, and the ugly? How's it going? And then the next one that we do in October 9th and 10th, we will focus on the recommendations for the next administration, whoever it is, and what they should be thinking about in terms of religious freedom. So with that, let me introduce the panel. I'm going to proceed from age to beauty. I'll let you decide what that order is. Obviously, we're starting with my father, and then we're ending with Will, and Tad being the perfect balance of the two. My father, Bob Seiple, is the president of the Council for America's First Freedom. It is a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing understanding and respect for religious freedom in diverse communities that work to develop sustainable environments for religious freedom worldwide, and I said that wrong, didn't I?
I wasn't listening.
He's also the founder of the Institute for Global Engagement, but the Council for America's First Freedom focuses on developing and promoting religious freedom here in the United States, and I'll let him speak further about that. He did found the Institute for Global Engagement after 2 years of service at the State Department as the first ever U.S. Ambassador for International Religious Freedom. Prior to that, he was the president of World Vision, the largest faith-based relief and development organization in the world. And before that, he was the president of Eastern College and Seminary, and before that, Brown University, which is also his alma mater. He is a proud author of The Missing Piece, which tells the story of reconciliation and the move to reconciliation with Vietnam, where he fought and flew 300 combat missions. And he is also co-editor with Dr. Hoover of Religion and Security, The New Nexus in International Affairs, and that book is also back in the back. Our second person to speak today is Tad Stahnke. He is the director of the Fighting Discrimination Program at Human Rights First, a nonprofit, nonpartisan international human rights organization. Prior to assuming this role, Tad worked at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom from 2000 to 2007, where he served as Deputy Executive Director for Policy, as well as Acting Executive Director in 2002 and 2007. He's also served as an expert in international human rights law and training officials from the Department of State, Justice, and Homeland Security, and he's worked as a research fellow and lecturer at Columbia Law School, teaching a seminar on religion, human rights, and religious freedom, and has authored or co-authored numerous scholarly publications, including Religion, State Issues, and the Right to Freedom or Religion or Belief, a comparative textual analysis of constitutions of predominantly Muslim states. He is an expert like no other, besides, of course, Will Inboden, who represents the beauty on this stage. And Will is among other things, he is a Stanford grad, and we don't want you to hold that against him, but Will is the senior vice president of the Legatum Institute for Global Development. It's an independent research, policy, and advisory organization. Before that, he was the senior director for strategic planning at the National Security Council. And before that, he served at the Office of International Religious Freedom. And before that, he was instrumental, one of the 4 main authors of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, working on the Hill. So what you have here today is a point of origin for the International Religious Freedom Act of 10 years in will and a Capitol Hill perspective, but you also have a national security and executive perspective. You have a State Department perspective in the form of my father, and Tad represents the U.S. Commission, which was also instituted at the time of the International Religious Freedom Act. So please join me in welcoming the first speaker, Ambassador Bob Seiple.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you all for coming. There are a lot of familiar faces here today that I know. There are also some heroes of mine that are here today. You know you're getting older when you're standing on a stage looking down at your heroes as opposed to sitting there and looking up at your heroes, and it's great to have them here and a source of encouragement as well. The topic of my talk today, for my 15 minutes of fame, is methodology, metrics, and moral imperatives. If you wonder after 15 minutes, what in the world is that guy talking about? I was talking about methodology, metrics, and moral imperatives. Chris told me that the hook was out at 15 minutes. We did lose one of our speakers, so I guess I have a little bit more than that. But we'll try to talk quickly so that all of us can get as much on the table as possible. And in that regard, I'd like to take the opening minute here and give you the 3 points that the next 15 minutes should elucidate, if not illuminate. Number one, the punishment component of the International Religious Freedom Act. And anyone who has been involved with it and saw the migration from the Wolf-Specter Act onwards and upwards, and then how the commission was put together and how that played off against the State Department and so on, will know that punishment was a theme. Promotion was a theme, and we'll talk a little bit about both of those today. My point here that I want you to remember as we go forward, the punishment component has not and will not advance this issue in the world. Number two, methodologies should focus on promotion, the promoting of religious freedom, and that promotion should be around points of vested self-interest. So we're not all just a bunch of naive human rights folks. Number three, public-private collaboration, which is to say the State Department and the non-governmental organizations, is absolutely essential to sustainable progress. And here's the provocative thought. Even if the State Department has to outsource the moral imperative. You may want to come back to that. Let me start with a story. When this act first passed, we brought in ambassadors that represented countries that were having big problems with religious freedom. And in the course of doing that, I brought in Ambassador Vang from Laos. In 1999, Laos was absolutely in the pits, probably one of the worst offenders in the entire world to come in. And I had a chance to explain what the new legislation meant, what my obligations were under the new legislation. We would be looking closely at Laos and the government of Laos, and we had the ability to punish people if they didn't fall into line. This poor guy, Ambassador Vang, you could see his entire professional life pass before his eyes. He said to me, why in the world would such a great power want to punish a poor country like Laos? The immediate thought that went through my mind, unspoken, was, because we can. And that was met by another unspoken, silent rebuke. Laos is obviously a poor country. Some countries are born poor, some countries are made poor. Laos is both. It was born poor, born in poverty, and made poor by war. A conflict that we had a great deal to do with. This is a statistic you may not have heard before. We dropped more bombs on Laos during the Vietnam War than were dropped on Germany during 4 years of World War II. There are still 400 plus crash sites. American airplanes going down in Laos, still under investigation. We gave them Agent Orange. We gave them cluster bombs. We gave them every armament that we had. And it's no wonder that today, years later, there is still a program for unexploded ordnance that goes on. In fact, the USAID folks run that in Laos. Every year, on average, about 100 people, mostly women and children, the kids going out into the fields to play, run into a bomb, blows off, 30 years later, after war should have been over, and we have one more casualty of that war. At the end of the 20th century, this was a country that had higher than 70% illiteracy, over 40% living below the poverty line. Major problems, and not the least of which was a stagnating, suffocating communist ideology. So we were asking Laos to make our agenda their number one agenda, their plan, in spite of all the obstacles. Now, I've got 3 takeaways from this little story. One is about punishment. We are indeed fascinated with punishment. In the Office of the International Religious Freedom, we would spend 90% of our time working on issues other than the countries of particular concern list. In fact, that was only about 10% of our time, but when the list finally became known to the media and to other organizations and to other institutions, that's what everybody gravitated towards. They wanted to know what happened to the list. Who'd you add to the list? My sense is anytime we added somebody to the list, it was a demonstration of failure on our part. Diplomacy lost. And we had to go out and find sanctions for people. For some people, it is the metric for success. For some institutions, it's the metric for success. How large is that list? This has all the attractiveness of a public hanging. And so we had sanctions as part of our mode of operation. Sanctions, I hope you know, are blunt instruments with a very checkered career. We don't do them well. Unilateral sanctions almost never work. And yet it seems many times it's our first step in diplomacy to threaten people with sanctions. We sanction more countries, we the United States sanction more countries than any 5 countries combined. It is important and was so important that in the original legislation there is a veritable menu of sanctions. Why? Even when we know that punishment does not change bad behavior. Why would we do that? Again, the unspoken commentary, because we can. Sanction talk works in Washington. It makes us feel good. We can rise up on our toes and our tiptoes and show righteous indignation. Normally that's coupled with rhetorical bombast and which becomes a key ingredient to a very toxic testosterone war, which happens over and over again in Washington. It works in Washington. Here's the key principle. It works absolutely in no other place in the world. And this was back in the 1990s. People think less of us today. If it didn't work then, it won't be working now. Has it changed China? Has it changed Burma? Has it changed Iran? Has it changed Sudan? These were 4 of the original countries we put on the countries of particular concern list. And 10 years later, they're all still on that list. Takeaway number 2, again, the context. The bill is very specific. It was very well written in my mind. Not all bills are. And it talked about promotion, that the key to this office and this initiative was to promote religious freedom worldwide. That's where the emphasis is. And then if you were to go back and read the mission statement for the office, it talks about the same thing. I know because I wrote it. Promotion, promotion, promotion. Now, you can focus on promotion, you can focus on punishment. Why is this important? Because whatever you choose, it will determine your methodology. It will determine how this bill is implemented and, in my mind, what kind of results will be forthcoming. Let me go back to Laos. We stopped making threats of this poor Ambassador Vong and said, basically, we want to work with you. What can we do together to get this train back on the tracks? How can we help one another? We don't want to throw the book at anybody. We want to build a relationship of trust. Well, important in that relationship of trust is also to realize what the other side may want. And there were 2 very clear points of vested self-interest. One was security, and the other was permanent normal trade relations. Security, important. And communists are paranoid always about security. And we got to a point where we could tell them, you know, the populace in your country, for them to be loyal, they have to feel that you have their best interest at heart. And for them to have, for you to have their best interest at heart, you need to do something that protects their religious freedoms. And once you do that, they will be loyal to you, more loyal than they are today. And once they're loyal, that country will be more stable, and once it's more stable, it will be more secure. The communist officials understood that. The relationship, two sides of the same coin, between security and religious freedom. And the other one, at the time, I think there were 4 countries in the world that did not enjoy PNTR. Laos was one of them. So a poor country was going to be whipped off the shelf into the dungeons of despair, economically speaking, unless that could happen. It finally did happen a couple of years ago. Unconscionably long wait for this country, but around those 2 items, we were able to get a lot of things done. Now you can say, that's not very pure. Well, you can have all the psychological, philosophical, ideological, intellectual discussions in the clear light of day here in Washington, but the offending country will always do the linkage. And so you might as well assume it's going to be done. Anyway, we started back with the Lao to build this relationship of trust. The first thing we did, we invited a high-level Lao delegation to come over here for 15 days. 6 people, the highest delegation at the time to be here. We took them into our churches, into our synagogues, into our mosque, into a Lao Buddhist temple out in Manasa. We showed them culture. We showed them sports. We introduced them to every key figure on the hill. We went to Ground Zero. We went to an Amish farm. The most exhausting 15 days of my life were spent with these people, learning their songs, them learning our songs, and so on. At the end of that time, with this much time to build trust and friendship, they went back to Laos. And in the next 2 weeks, on their own nickel, because the Lao government doesn't fund these kind of things, they spread out over all of Laos. We had at the time 37 people of faith who had been in prison because of their faith. And during those 2 weeks, they allowed 34 of the 37 to be let go. Major, major, major deal. And when we go back today and talk to these folks, they say, the government folks, they say, you know, that was the turning point in the relationship. Having that much time to spend together and to be on your turf and to listen to your talks. We started a Lao Day. We used to have a home out here on the Eastern Shore. One day in the summer, we invited the entire Lao embassy out. We'd put up the Lao flag, put up a tent. The drivers were off fishing or off boating or something, and we'd sit there and talk great thoughts. We'd take them in the boat up to the Russian Dhaka, their summer home for the embassy here. They didn't have one, so we made our home the Lao Dhaka, and they liked that. Anytime they wanted, they could come out there. We played a lot of rounds of golf together, never very well, but we played a lot of rounds of golf. We had interminable meetings, and we continued to go back year after year into Laos. The response. In the last few years, we've had 2 religious freedom conferences in Laos that the Lao National Front hosted and sponsored, where they brought in the village chiefs and the gendarmes and the district officials, the headbangers in the Communist Party, for a day of talks. I keynoted both of those. I finished up the day. In the middle 2 sessions, we had someone, my counterpart from the Lao, doing the talking about religious freedom in their country. Never happened before in a communist country, religious freedom conference. They started to work on a law. Laos has 63 total laws, that's all they have. But there's a prime minister's decree right now where they have gone to the various denominations, asked them for their input, and have put together a law for religious freedom. It's not the best, they never are. It's better not to have a law than a bad law, but this is a major step forward. Last year when I was there, they asked me at the Foreign Ministry Institute if I would come and talk about religious freedom, and I, of course, did that as well. Marked improvement. And there is a point of the legislation that says we are to note marked improvement. And 2 years ago, the marked improvement fell to only 2 countries, Kazakhstan and Laos. And by the way, my ambassadorial friend, Mr. Vong, has become a close family friend. Now, if I had more time, I could trace the same kind of progress that took place in Vietnam. Same principles of relational diplomacy, people staying at the table over time. So it's happening. Takeaway number 3, the official and the unofficial, the public and the private, the State Department and the NGOs need to work together. If I were you, I'd say it's a very legitimate question. After 10 years, there's only 2 countries you can point to that have shown progress. Why only 2? Well, it takes time. What Niebuhr called a long obedience in the same direction. It takes time. We're not big on time. We're held hostage to annual reports, to election cycles, to 5-year plans, to ambassadorial rotations. All of those things work against relational diplomacy. They keep seeing new faces with new agendas. Secondly, the State Department has never been known for speed. I guess I can say that since I've been there, but every new idea has to go through an onerous clearance process. I try to deny the word. And by the time it gets through those onerous clearance processes, the original idea looks nothing like what came out the other end. Celebrity players, the appointed ambassadors, they're not going to stay at the table. All these guys come in for 2 or 3 years. They've got an agenda of 3 things that they want to accomplish while they're there, and that's it. And that's their legacy, and then they're gone. In terms of consistent, steady, intentional pressure, it's lacking. It can't be applied. The structure and the culture of the institution does not allow for that. So let me give you a solution. You know about diplomacy at the State Department. You know about Track 2 diplomacy. I'm going to suggest today something called Track 1.5 diplomacy. Again, some context. We all live for the day when our national interest and our national values will be one and the same. It's not so right now. We have hard power and we have soft power. We have realpolitik and we have moral imperatives. And sometimes they don't get very close to one another, even though we talk about it, even though we promise that to everybody. And that's an inconsistency. And the Achilles heel of human rights is inconsistency. And by the way, you wonder why people don't like us? Because we're inconsistent and we're powerful enough to get away with it. That's the biggest reason we have problems in the world today. Anyway, that's the context. How do we create a consistent approach, consistent pressure on some of these things? And I would suggest humbly, because I know this is a provocative thought, that the moral imperative should be outsourced to those who have the time and the space to manage it. In the field, the ambassador will be working with a dozen or so issues at any one time. They're all important. The United States says they're all important. The non-governmental organization, that organization that was put together for a cause or for a reason or for a motivating source, whatever, probably only has one. They have the time. They're not going to change faces. They're not going to change motivations. Their motivation is pure from the start to finish. The reason we have an agreement in Africa between Frelimo and Renamo after 16 years of civil war is because the lay Catholic order of St. Egidio stayed at the table for 10 years to get it when all the other ambassadorial types came and went and came and went. I'm suggesting that the FSO and the ambassadors should monitor these things, direct these things, make sure we're always on the same page here, but be prepared to allow the NGO to handle the moral imperative. Not alone, of course, but find one that you can work with and find one that understands this and finds an ambassador that can put it into implementation phase. One last comment from the Laos, and then I'll stop. From Laos, the last trip, last March, I think it was, we were there. And our very last meeting, we were with the Deputy Prime Minister, Samsavat. Good man. He has come to be known to us and vice versa over a long period of time. He's a good listener. He's a problem solver. We've taken some very difficult things to him. He's been able to fix them. We walk into his room, and I'm with the ambassador from, our ambassador to Laos. And he runs up to me, and he has this huge smile on his face. And he gives me a bear hug, and he pumps my hands. And he says, "Welcome, your family. Welcome to Laos." The ambassador is wincing at everything that's going on here. Now, what's going on here? You know, at one level, I've been going there for 19 years. She's been going there for 3 years. But at a more important level, I've got one issue. And I'm there to celebrate that one issue. She's got 12 issues. And the reason they are issues is because they're problems that have yet to be solved. There are things that I can do that she can't do. There's a whole bunch of things that she can do that I can't do. And so this interactive, collaborative experience, even if it means making sure, doing it to make sure that the moral imperative is not lost sight of in our realpolitik world. The solution to why there are only two and there should be more, we need time and we need relationships, collaborations that are built that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and right on time, as the former Marine you are. Tad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. I'm not a former Marine, but I'll try to stay on time as well. And although I come from a human rights background and continue to work in the human rights field, I will try not to be naive, as Ambassador Seiple has so rightly warned all of us not to be. I think that as I'm looking around the room, and I want to thank Chris and Dennis and Tom for putting this together and for thinking of me to come and talk about the Commission and to include the Commission in, as an object in this discussion. I feel like I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I think there are people out there that don't know an awful lot about the Commission. It's not a particularly well-known institution, but then there are some of you that know an awful lot about it, and I'm going to try to balance my remarks so that everyone can link into them somehow. The Commission is a very strange animal. It's a unique thing, I think, in terms of the International Religious Freedom Act and what it tried to do. It tried to get the U.S. government to pay more attention to promoting religious freedom as part of its foreign policy. And it set up all these various mechanisms to do that, an annual report, an ambassador at large. Bob mentioned the countries of particular concern. This is where the president or the secretary of state is supposed to designate those countries that are in essence, the worst violators, and then follow up with some sort of action. It also created the Commission on International Religious Freedom, and it's, again, an unusual body. I think the original idea was that something like religious freedom, given what had happened in the past, it was not really thought that the State Department could be trusted to really take this issue and advance it in a wholehearted way. And I think it's interesting what Bob said about the department and the ability to integrate a moral imperative into what it's trying to do and the problems that are associated with that. But certainly also religious freedom is a practical step that can be taken in many countries as well. And as he said, you're trying to sell this as being in country's best interest, and that's something that the State Department should be good at doing. But anyway, the Act created the Commission, and here it is. It's been around. It really began in 1999, so it's been around for almost 10 years, and it's a independent entity. It's bipartisan. It's part of the U.S. government, and it has a mandate that's specific to religious freedom. And I think that all four of those aspects give it a certain amount of strength if they are well tended in terms of the actions of the Commission. And I'm just going to go through them relatively briefly to talk a little bit about what the Commission has done and reflect on that a little bit. The overall mission of the Commission is to give policy advice to the President, the Secretary of State, and the White House. And I think that overall it's been a relatively mixed picture. I know that certainly A lot of the advice has fallen on deaf ears for one reason or another, and there's still a tremendous amount of promise that I think exists in the institution in the framework of U.S. foreign policy, and I think some of the things that Bob touched on actually provide an interesting angle for the Commission participation in implementation of that policy. Well, first of all, the Commission is independent. So it's not part of the executive branch, it's part of the legislative branch, but it's really not part of the Congress. Commissioners are private individuals, they're not being paid for what it is that they're doing. And this is an extremely important aspect of it because it means that the Commission can talk directly to the public about religious freedom. And this is a precious commodity that needs to be used judiciously, but it's something that really makes the Commission unique. It can talk directly to the public without having to filter its thoughts in order to look at the other sorts of issues that the State Department or the White House or even the Congress have to bear in mind when they're talking about other countries and U.S. relations with other countries. I think the Commission has preserved its independence fairly well over the time period, and the metric for that is that it's managed to piss off just about everybody in the U.S. government at one time or another. Democratic and Republican administrations, Democratic and Republican Congresses, State Department, White House, even DOJ and DHS over time. That also has been an important feature of what the Commission has done, but people don't really understand this independence, and that leads to some problems that I'm going to touch on a little bit later. Most people in foreign countries don't believe that the Commission is independent. They don't understand what that means. They don't understand the distinction between the Commission and the State Department, and that is an ongoing problem that requires a certain amount of effort on both sides to address. So in addition to being independent, the Commission is also bipartisan, and so they're appointed by both Republican and Democratic appointees in the House and in the Senate, as well as in the White House. And the Commission from the very beginning took a further step, and that is to decide that the chair every year was going to rotate between Democratic and Republican appointees. So every year, no matter how many, for instance, Republican appointees you have on the Commission, right? And since Bush has been in the White House, you have 5 Republican appointees and 4 Democratic appointees. This chair is going to rotate between the two, so that's a further kind of recognition that the bipartisan aspect of the Commission is really important. And over the years, the Commission's generally been able to make its decisions on a bipartisan basis and on a consensual basis. It's really sought consensus over time. And this is a critical element because I think to the extent that people are going to take the Commission seriously, it has to be on the basis of consensus, because consensus is sort of a barometer, a political barometer of what's possible in terms of U.S. policy, from a body like the Commission. And if it's not based on consensus, it's hard to imagine who's really going to pay much attention to it. Let me see here. The third aspect about the Commission is that it's government, right? It's part of the U.S. government, which is a little bit unusual. And I think the Commission and the commissioners over time have thought that this is a good thing because it gives the authority of the U.S. government behind the Commission's decisions. We had in the office, eventually we got a big seal, and the seal had the big eagle on it, and that's on our publications and et cetera. So in essence, it provides an aura of governmental authority to it. But I think that over time, it's never really been worked out how the Commission fits into the rest of the government apparatus, because it's not an easy fit. As I said, it's not part of the executive branch, so it's not an easy fit with the White House. It's certainly not an easy fit with the State Department. even though the ambassador at large has the honor of serving on the commission. Probably the most interesting aspect of how it fits into the government is with the Congress, and it's really too bad that David's not here, but Will can talk a little bit maybe about that. That the Congress has an interesting role to play with U.S. foreign policy, and the Commission, as a non-executive body, should be relating to the Congress in order to advance that policy. So there's a couple of different roles that the Commission could play with regard to its fit in the U.S. government apparatus. The one that it's taken on the most of is a sort of watchdog role, and that is, well, if it was created because there was a concern that the State Department may not be fully on board with advancing religious freedom as far as U.S. foreign policy is concerned, well, how well is it doing over time? And the Commission has paid a certain amount of attention to that, and it's an important role in some respects because there's an awful lot of promise in the Religious Freedom Act, and seeing that promise turned into reality is a tremendous amount of hard work, as Bob was describing, and the Commission looking at how well the State Department is doing provides a window into what progress has been made and what might be out there that remains to be done. But again, without really knowing where this entity fits into the policymaking apparatus, it's hard to know what sort of impact the Commission's pronouncements on how well the State Department or the White House is doing to promote religious freedom. It's hard to know how that is going to translate into an effort to implement some of the Commission's policy advice. So I think a lot of the Commission's work has fallen on deaf ears in that regard, and that's unfortunate. They're really taking aside from the watchdog role. I mean, there's another, perhaps more strategic role that the Commission could play in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but there really hasn't been much effort put into thinking about how that might happen. It's happened around the edges sometimes on a kind of ad hoc basis, but in places like Turkmenistan, for instance, Bangladesh, Sudan to some extent, Vietnam to some extent, most recently, as well as thinking through U.S. foreign aid on particular programs. I mean, these are areas where the Commission has not necessarily so much taken the role of watchdog, but has played somewhat different roles in terms of what the White House or what the State Department or what the Congress is trying to do at any particular one time. And I think that's an interesting thing to continue to think about, that the Commission and its government partners really need to make more of an effort to think about how the Commission fits into a U.S. government strategy to promote religious freedom in some of these places, and in particular, congressional strategy to do that. One particular aspect that's been, I think, somewhat difficult to work out is the Commission can go to foreign countries and speak directly to foreign governments. And this is a powerful opportunity and also a somewhat delicate opportunity in terms of U.S. relations. And without a more coordinated approach to what's going on, it's difficult to see how you can get more out of what the Commission can do in foreign countries. It's tended to go to talk to foreign governments and raise issues. Yes, thank you very much. And then goodbye, maybe we'll never see you again. And that's not the most strategic way to use this resource. So I think that a certain amount of effort needs to be put into that. The last element of the Commission that I think provides its value added is it has a mandate specific to religious freedom. And it's one of the few entities anywhere that has that particular focus, but certainly in the government. Other than arguably the Office of International Religious Freedom, it's really the only body in the government that really can just focus on religious freedom. Although the Commission has to be realistic in terms of its policy recommendations, it really, as I said before, it doesn't need to filter these recommendations, through the other foreign policy priorities that can bog down and make it more difficult to be working in the State Department on these issues, and also in the White House, and even in the Congress to do that. And the Commission's ability to focus its attention solely on religious freedom really raises a couple of possibilities. The first is that the Commission is able to raise issues that are being ignored in the policy apparatus. And I think the Commission has done a pretty good job of this over time. Issues that were not being discussed so much in policy circles, the Commission was able to raise them and bring that a little more into the mix. Sudan and the Civil War, for instance, in U.S. policy with regard to the war, is one example. The conditions in Saudi Arabia before 9/11, where people were really not paying very much attention to it. The events of Gujarat in India in 2002, 2003, this was something, again, that the U.S. government was not paying an awful lot of attention to. Even North Korea Commission was raising this issue and trying to bring it to the forefront before the axis of evil speech. So it's one of the things that the Commission can continue to do. The other thing that it can do is it can actually spend time thinking about particular issues. And time is a very precious commodity when you have all sorts of things that you want to do in the government and all sorts of bureaucratic requirements and other things that are impinging on you. To actually have someone there who can take the time to look at a particular issue, to engage opinion on that issue, is really something that can be used to advantage. And the Commission has done a little bit of this over time, not necessarily in a coordinated way, but it's sort of fallen into a couple of particular aspects. One that would seem to hold an awful lot of promise is looking at the role of individual rights in Muslim countries and the extent to which individual Muslims in societies where it's an Islamic state or Islam is the religion of the state have the freedom to discuss and debate and to talk about religion and the ability of that to be protected to some extent. I mean, that's a very tall order, but it's something that came out very clearly, I think, when you look at what happened following the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and following the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, is a critical issue of discussion. What role is religion going to play in these new political atmospheres? And then a second question related to that is how free are people going to be able to discuss that issue? And the Commission has tried to play a role there. It's also did a project on comparative constitutionalism for predominantly Muslim countries. Produced a report that was well used and well received, again, by focusing. This is something that people didn't have the attention to do. You know, they didn't have the attention to say, well, how does this country do it, and how does that country do it, when they were looking at, when the U.S. government was looking at trying to play a role in terms of a new Afghan constitution, a new Iraq constitution, et cetera. So I think there's an awful lot that really can continue to be done in that area as well. And finally, in terms of its specific mandate, I think there were two concerns at the outset that were prevalent about the Commission and about U.S. policy as a whole, and I thought I would just address them briefly. And that was, it was based or stems from the idea that maybe the mandate of the commission, maybe the mandate of this IRFA was really too narrow. In one respect, that it prioritized religious freedom above other rights because it had all of this apparatus focused particularly on religious freedom. And I think that that's a danger that the Commission has tried to avoid over time, and I think it's done a fairly good job of looking at religious freedom in the context of other important rights, the administration of justice, freedom of conscience, these other things, not looking at it alone, but looking at it in terms of a full spectrum of government policies and practices, that have an impact on it. The other thing is that there was a real concern that there'd be an over-focus on Christians. Christian groups had a big role to play in the beginning in terms of developing the IRFA, promoting it in the Congress. So this was something, and it's something that's projected onto the Commission and its work over time. And again, I think if you look at the record, that's not something that has panned out because of the concern really across the board. I mean, Christians are minorities in many countries, and minorities are certainly concerns in a lot of countries. But the Commission has also been concerned with other minorities, non-Christians, Muslims in various countries. And I think that the persistence of this criticism is really, to some extent, about not being able to communicate very well how all-encompassing this religious freedom project is for the U.S. government. So I think that's a big challenge, and I think it'll be interesting to hear your panel in the afternoon about that issue. Well, I'm going to close with just a couple of points in terms of the challenges ahead. I think the two biggest challenges for the Commission are, and really in terms of the whole complex of U.S. foreign policy, is where does it fit in? Is it inside the policy apparatus, or is it outside the policy apparatus? It really hasn't been worked out. There's been a lot of looking at it from the outside, staying outside, preserving the ability to criticize what's going on. Not so much attention to building the sorts of relationships with policymakers inside the government where you can agree to disagree on certain things, but where you can agree, you can work together to try to move something forward towards a common goal. And again, the Commission as an instrument has some interesting aspects to it that can be employed. And when there's an agreement over what you're seeking and over over policy in general, then you can begin to develop more of a strategic relationship. But then the other aspect of this is that, the Commission is supposed to give policy advice to the U.S. government, tell the U.S. government how to promote religious freedom, and it really needs to come to grips with the fact that the ability of U.S. policy to have an impact on the ground around the world is severely diminished in the last 10 years. And particularly in areas related to religion, related to human rights. So, I mean, this is something that is extremely important because you don't want to have an animated discussion in a small corner when what's happening around the world is really something else. And I think this requires a certain amount of creative thinking on the part of the Commission to really build allies on the ground in other countries. I mean, I think that's my takeaway from the story that Bob was saying, is that you need to engage with people in order to find who your allies are out there, and then to try to work with them and encourage through appealing to their self-interest. I don't think it's only positive things. The act provides the threat of negative consequences, and that can be a motivating factor as well. But you really need to get out there, maintain long-term relationships, build allies, and try to slowly, incrementally change policy in these countries. It's really not easy. When you look at major advances in religious freedom, they come from political upheavals. I think that U.S. policies doesn't necessarily have much control over, except probably in a very negative way. But you're trying to preserve what's there. You're trying to slowly and incrementally advance the ball, and that takes time, and it takes a strategy, and it takes focus, and this is something that is really important. But the Commission, and I'll end here, through its character of sort of government, but made up of private individuals, made up from a bipartisan spectrum, a spectrum of religious communities that are represented, it creates opportunities that are not available to an ambassador, to someone from the State Department, to a political officer, to even a member of Congress. And I think that that's something that is hasn't been so recognized yet, and something that can be worked on much further. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tad. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Bob. As Chris mentioned in his introduction, I've worked on religious freedom issues in a number of different capacities over the last several years. On the Hill, at the State Department, brief scholarly hiatus. I'm going to confine my remarks today to assessing the role of the White House in implementing the International Religious Freedom Act. And while on the one hand the State Department is the lead implementer of the IRF Act and carries 90% of the brunt of implementation, the White House does have a key role to play in a number of ways, and really is, I think, overall indispensable to the successful implementation of the Act. The President, after all, is the chief executive, he's the chief diplomat, he's the commander-in-chief, and he's got the chief bully pulpit. And in all those different ways, there can be ramifications for religious freedom implementation. And these include defining strategic priorities, appointment of personnel, diplomatic activity and gestures, policy decisions, and then budget and programming priorities. And I'll flesh out a little bit of detail on those in a minute. I'll start with kind of a brief overview of the Clinton administration's role in implementing the IRF Act, and then move into the Bush administration's role, the Bush White House role. And I would kind of summarize the Clinton administration posture as kind of moving from opposition to implementation. The Clinton White House had just 2 years remaining in office at the time of the IRF Act's passage. But in this time, the Clinton administration took a number of significant and important steps into implementing the IRF Act. First and most consequentially, President Clinton signed it into law. And after it had passed Congress. And this had not been a foregone conclusion. When the act had first been drafted and introduced in Congress, the Clinton White House had been more or less opposed to it, or at least resistant to it, but then kind of pivoted to a posture of negotiation, and a number of us working on the act at the time were able to satisfy a number of their concerns over how the sanctions were designed, over executive prerogatives and the like, and eventually got it to a point where everyone agreed that this would be workable. And so, again, President Clinton deserves success for signing it into law, because if he hadn't, it wouldn't have happened. Second, once the IRF Act was passed, the Clinton White House took some steps to integrate religious freedom into its national security policy. And I think most symbolic of this is looking at the various national security strategies that were passed during the time. And again, for those of you not familiar with it, because this will bear in my remarks about the Bush White House also, an administration's national security strategy is kind of its most magisterial statement about its foreign policy priorities. It's not just a report to Congress, or it's also a message to the American people. It's a message to the world and to the media, and it's also a guide to the interagency, to the different departments and agencies on what are their policy priorities supposed to be, and how should they be implementing them? If you ever want to kind of do an assessment of an administration's foreign policy priorities, usually their NSS is the first place to look. And the 1998 NSS released by the Clinton administration, this is right before the IRF Act was passed, just made kind of a passing mention to religious freedom. I was only able to find it mentioned in one place in about 50 pages, and that's kind of buried in the democracy and human rights section, saying, oh, and we'll combat religious persecution. So an acknowledgement of it, but really very, very little treatment. In contrast, the 1999 Clinton White House National Security Strategy, which they issued several months after the IRF Act, gives it religious freedom a much more fulsome treatment. I'll read an excerpt here. It declares, promotion of religious freedom is one of the highest concerns in our foreign policy. Freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is a bedrock issue for the American people. To that end, the President signed the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which provides the flexibility needed to advance religious freedom and to counter religious persecution. Again, it was a start, and that, especially compared it with previous NSSs from the Clinton White House, showed a beginning to incorporate the IRF Act into their broader foreign policy portfolio, and signal to the departments and agencies, especially the State Department, that there was support from the White House for giving religious freedom more primacy. So, third, mindful of the adage that personnel is policy, the Clinton administration made a key positive personnel decision with the religious freedom, and that was appointing Bob Seiple as the ambassador at large for religious freedom. Again, Bob had already been working at the State Department as was it senior advisor, Bob, on religious freedom issues, and so already was there. But again, the question of who would they appoint as the ambassador at large sent a powerful signal about, did this issue matter? Were they going to appoint someone who had respect across a broad spectrum, who had experience in a number of different areas, and was seen as credible by the religious freedom community? And I think that was, appointing Bob was one of the most important things they could do and did do. Then finally, on a specific policy decision, I think had broader ramifications for the seriousness with which they were taking religious freedom policy, is in 1999. When the Clinton White House agreed with Secretary Albright's recommendation to designate China as a country of particular concern, as one of the more severe violators of religious freedom. And again, that hadn't been a foregone conclusion. It's easy to kind of give negative designations to countries that are relatively small, don't have other foreign policy priorities for us, and there's not a lot of ramifications. But with China, who is very important in terms of the trade relationship and other strategic priorities, when the Clinton administration agreed to designate China as a CPC, it did quite a bit to bolster the IRF Act's credibility across the board, and signal that religious freedom would, on occasion, win out in internal policy disputes, even if it meant increased friction with an important bilateral partner. Turning now to the Bush White House, I kind of summarize the Bush White House's religious freedom policy as a integrated strategy but uneven implementation. And I'll kind of review a few of the highlights here. Some of these I was just an observer for before I had joined the administration. Others I was a participant in, and I'll try to signal those. So on May 3rd, 2001, just a few months after President Bush had been sworn into office, he made a consequential assertion in a speech on religious freedom before the American Jewish Committee. And in this speech, the entire speech was devoted to religious freedom. And he described religious freedom as the first freedom of the human soul. Moreover, in this speech, and keep in mind this is in May of 2001, before September 11th, before any of the other major foreign policy crises of the administration, the president singled out for mention, just kind of as examples of especially egregious violators of religious freedom, a number of different countries. And though it was unknown to him at the time, several of the ones he mentioned, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and China, would soon also come to constitute the major national security challenges facing his administration. And this vividly illustrates, I think, the promise but also the challenge of religious freedom policy. It can serve as a diagnostic tool or a type of early warning system, revealing nations which are irresponsible global actors, which may even be looming security threats. I've shared the anecdote before, and a number of you would be familiar with this, that in the late 1990s, it seems like the only communities paying attention to what was going on in Afghanistan under the Taliban were women's rights advocates and religious freedom advocates, saying this is just dreadful, this oppression that's going on there. But a lot of the rest of the so-called sophisticated foreign policy establishment said, well, that is too bad what's happening in Afghanistan. What's our national interest? What do we care? It's poor, it's backwards, impoverished. There's no national interest for us in what's happening there. But I think looking back, and again, this is not a partisan comment, the Bush administration and the Clinton administration and all of us really are equally at fault. If we would have paid a little more attention that the depredations of the Taliban, which were so appalling to women's rights and religious freedom advocates, were also very appealing to Al Qaeda and to Bin Laden, which is why he was so happy to set up shop there. But anyways, like I said, it's interesting looking back at the Bush speech from May and see that of the 5 or 6 countries he highlights for being religious freedom violators, those basically anticipated all of the major foreign policy, national security challenges of the administration. Even though in the speech he didn't draw those linkages. Now, the Bush administration issued their first national security strategy in September 2002, 1 year after the September 11th attacks. And the 2002 NSS, the first one of the administration, took a further step in elevating religious freedom as a priority and declared that we will take special efforts to promote freedom of religion and conscience and defend it from encroachment by repressive governments. However, this NSS didn't go much beyond that, so it didn't, other than kind of making a nice assertion there, which again was empowering to those of us working at the State Department at the time to drive it as more of a priority. It didn't integrate religious freedom with this broader web of national security concerns and priorities. But just over 2 years later, when President Bush gave his second inaugural address, heralding that the survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands, America's vital interests and our deepest beliefs are now one. This strengthened the conceptual foundation for integrating religious freedom into a broader strategic framework by so explicitly linking values and interests and what happens abroad with our security at home. And the national security strategy issued for the second Bush term, then picked up on this and tried to elaborate on these principles. And this is where I did have more of a participant role than just an observer in full disclosure. But what happened is President Bush and senior members of his national security team, Steve Hadley, Secretary Rice, took a very active role in producing this NSS. And for those of us who are kind of the sort of at the staff level working on producing some of the initial drafts, we were given guidance to integrate religious freedom into the broader issue of democracy promotion and into the broader matrix of security interests. And so, like I said, even though there was, staff, those of us who will kind of do the initial drafts, the president and Steve Hadley took a very active role in producing it and wanted to make sure that this integration was there. So this is why the language we came up on religious freedom in the 2006 NSS tried to do that. And declared, in effective democracies, freedom is indivisible. Political, religious, and economic liberty advance together and reinforce each other. Furthermore, identifying religious freedom as facing particular peril around the world, the NSS asserts, against a terrorist enemy that is defined by religious intolerance, we defend the first freedom. Again, elevating religious freedom as the first freedom. The right of people to believe and worship according to the dictates of their own conscience, free from the coercion of the state, the coercion of the majority, or the coercion of a minority that wants to dictate what others must believe. And then that was in the chapter on democracy promotion, but also in the chapter on counterterrorism in this NSS. Again, there was an explicit linkage of religious freedom promotion with the ideological conflict. The strategy to counter the lies behind the terrorist ideology is to empower the very people the terrorists most want to exploit, the faithful followers of Islam. We will continue to support political reforms that empower peaceful Muslims to practice and interpret their faith. So again, those were some of the strategic principles that, at least by the second term, the Bush administration was trying to lay out there, integrating religious freedom with a broader democracy and economic development agenda, as well as with the counterterrorism and security agenda. And then President Bush's visit to the Washington Islamic Center, just up here on Massachusetts Avenue, the next year in 2007, illustrated one effort to apply some of these strategic insights. This was on the 50th anniversary of the dedication of the Islamic Center in 1957, when President Eisenhower had made a historic visit there to kind of bring greetings to the American people and welcome the building and opening of this mosque in the nation's capital. So when President Bush went there in 2007, he gave a speech, and he began by noting the dearth of religious freedom in the Middle East. And then he recognized the need, in his words, to help millions of Muslims as they rescue a proud and historic religion from murderers and beheaders who seek to soil the name of Islam. He then announced his intention to appoint for the first time ever a presidential envoy to the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference. And this also illustrates how a president can kind of intervene within his own bureaucracy to take steps to promote religious freedom. The idea of appointing a presidential envoy to the OIC had been developed at the staff level at the NSC a year or two before, but it had been totally bollocksed up by opposition from a number of officials over at the State Department. It was just kind of at this bureaucratic impasse. So when it came time to go to the Islamic Center, the president kind of stepped in and said, "No, I want to do this OIC envoy. I'm going to announce it there, and we're going to pick someone good." So he announced it at the OIC, and then he proceeded to appoint Sada Kumber to fill the position. And the selection of Kumber also sent a particularly powerful message on religious freedom, as he's an Ismaili Muslim, which, as many of you may know, is a Shia community which experiences widespread discrimination and persecution from Sunnis in many parts of the Islamic world. So not just appointing an OIC envoy, but appointing someone from a minority sect within Islam who feels very personally the burden of religious freedom and tolerance. Then regarding important personnel decisions for religious freedom policy, again, the most important one that a president will make is arguably the religious freedom ambassador at the State Department. And again, following up on the Clinton administration making a choice in Bob Seiple of an experienced religious freedom hand, the President Bush appointed, as many of you know, John Hanford to fill the role. And again, I think this said something interesting at the time about the Bush administration's decision-making on religious freedom, because there was a lot of domestic pressure at the time to appoint someone who was much more visible, much more known by a lot of interest groups across the country. Different religious groups had their favorite candidates. And John Hanford was just not very well known across the country. He's certainly well known to many within the Beltway, to many religious freedom practitioners. And I think it said something that the Bush White House wanted to appoint someone who had more expertise in the issue rather than would necessarily satisfy a number of domestic constituencies. Then President Bush's religious freedom policy has also included, I think, an unprecedented level of personal diplomacy and symbolic gestures, such as meeting with religious dissidents. And China offers, I think, the most telling example here. Bush has met personally with leading representatives of 4 of the main persecuted religious communities in China: Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghur Muslims, Protestants, and Catholics. For example, while he's followed the practice of his successors, Bush 41 and Clinton, in meeting several times at the White House with the Dalai Lama, recently the Bush 43 took it one step further in meeting publicly with the Dalai Lama when he was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. And that stirred quite a bit of ire in Beijing, as you may have noticed. It even kind of was linked to them denying our aircraft carrier port visit to Hong Kong at Thanksgiving. So again, I think that was an important symbolic step of going one step further, meeting publicly with the Dalai Lama, even after the Chinese government had sent a number of signals ahead of time saying they didn't want that. Then, again, in 2006, despite a number of threats from Beijing, the President Bush met in the White House with 3 Chinese Protestants who are leaders in house church movements, but also are legal and political reformers. And again, as far as we can tell, it appears that this was the first time that a sitting U.S. president had ever held a White House meeting with Chinese dissidents who are still active in China. President Clinton had met with Wei Jingsheng before, but that's after he had been exiled from China. So as far as we can tell, it's the first time that a sitting U.S. president had met with dissidents active in China. And the meeting with the 3 Chinese Protestant house church leaders also signaled a holistic support for religious leaders as political activists. It's sending the signal that our support for their religious freedom includes our support for their judicial activities, their labor rights activities, their work against coercive abortion and like back in China. And again, that was part of the broader effort of integrating religious freedom into a broader foreign policy agenda. There's also a couple of humorous moments in the meeting. At the end of the meeting, the Chinese Protestant leaders wanted to have a prayer with the president. And he said, "Okay, well, in my house, we hold hands when we pray." But a visibly uncomfortable vice president and national security advisor were kind of standing off to the sides. The president, "Dick, grab hands." So anyway, everyone had to grab hands with the Chinese Protestants and that old-time religion. So. Then last year, President Bush met at the White House with Hong Kong's Catholic Cardinal Joseph Zen. And this support for Zen, a leading Catholic voice for religious and political freedom in Hong Kong and in mainland China, also illustrated the relationship between religious freedom and a broader democracy agenda. And then finally, at the Prague Democracy Conference, sponsored by the Jewish former Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky, President Bush met with Uyghur Muslim leader Rabia Kadir, who had been recently released from several years imprisonment for her religious freedom and human rights activities in China. And again, there was quite a bit of protest from Beijing over that. So this is not to say that religious freedom advocacy has always carried the day at the White House. On other occasions, the White House would decide against holding a suggested meeting with a religious dissident or activist, sometimes because doing so is judged to potentially undermine other important policy concerns. So again, this is why I said that there's, while there's been, I think, some progress on strategic integration, there's certainly been uneven implementation here. Then on other policy decisions, as with President Clinton's decision to appoint China, to designate China as a CPC, President Bush also took a significant policy step in 2004 in agreeing to designate Saudi Arabia as a country of particular concern. And again, anyone who had followed the CPC list over the years, Saudi Arabia had always been sort of the glaring exception, which really undermined the credibility of the CPC list. This goes back to what Bob was saying about consistency in implementation is always the kind of hobgoblin of government's credibility. And people would say, how can this list have any credibility if you don't have Saudi Arabia on it? So despite a number of other important strategic equities there, the president agreed with Secretary Powell's recommendation to designate Saudi as a CPC. In conclusion, I'll just kind of suggest one or two areas where I think a little bit of progress was made, but a lot more could be made. And this is one that I hope that future administrations will take up. And we can call this section Follow the Money. Oftentimes, how an administration spends its money, its budget priorities, are a helpful proxy for what its other foreign policy priorities are. There's not always a one-to-one correlation here, and so we don't want to take this too far. But again, it can be roughly determinative. In this sense, the question of religious freedom in foreign aid and in democracy and development programming is instructive. The bottom line is there just has been hardly any money devoted in democracy programming to religious freedom programming over the last, ever since our government's been doing democracy promotion, really. It's so hard to measure, it's almost more anecdotal. And at the same time, I know there's been some recent progress with the Congress appropriating $4 million to the State Department's Democracy and Human Rights Fund, specifically earmarked for religious freedom promotion, and that represents a good start. But the Bush administration did not, in our budget requests, never made much of a priority of developing religious freedom programming. So I think more progress could be made there for future administrations. So looking back over the last decade since the passage of the IRF Act, both the Clinton and Bush White Houses took some notable steps to help carry out the letter and spirit of the law. And considering the previous marginalization of religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy, considering kind of the really low starting point. These steps are not insignificant. Like I said, I've tried to highlight some of the more notable ones. But these steps also aren't sufficient either, and the next administration will have much to build on, but much more to do. So thank you very much.
That was a wonderful and comprehensive discussion, highlighted by its breadth, depth, and candor. What I heard was religious freedom as a new issue of sorts that is increasingly elevated and integrated into U.S. foreign policy, but in an uneven and inconsistent manner. In fact, the State Department, with notable exceptions, perhaps in Laos and Vietnam, is still practicing the wrong approach. And USCIRF, while it provides a space to raise ignored issues and talk about issues that nobody's thinking about, is still not being listened to by too many people. And so in the response to the questions that we have over the next 15 or 20 minutes, I wonder if each of our presenters could, in our superficial and shallow DC way, assess or provide a grade for the last 10 years, just in terms of what do you think we've done with these 10 years. And as we open the floor to questions, I do want to raise some of the issues that have been brought out by the various discussions that I think bear further thought. One, what does the State Department or should the State Department outsource its moral imperative? What is the nature of public-private relationships in promoting religious freedom? Does the American government focus too much on Christians? I think that's a very real issue to think about, and I can tell you if whether you agree with that or not, that is the perception overseas. Is religious freedom highlighted too much? Is it number one in a hierarchy of human rights such that other human rights are diminished by default, or are they a blendless seam of things? And as Tad said, do you really have to engage in order to encourage? I think that's something that bears further thought for all the instruments of U.S. power. And the last thing that I would call your attention to is what Will said, and the idea that religious freedom can be a diagnostic, but also an early warning system for future conflict. And in that sense, as the National Security Strategy of '06 has noted, is religious freedom actually the ultimate counterterrorism tool of some sort? So with that, we're going to open the floor for questions. We'll go until about 10:45, 10:50, take a 10-minute break, and then go to the next session. Father. There's a mic behind you, sir.
Right, former Foreign Service and now part-time at Catholic University. I didn't hear anything at all about the military aspect, particularly the on-the-ground responsibility that many of the NATO and other American troops have to look after those who are being threatened because of their religion, especially in the Iraq situation. I wonder if any of you might have any comment here. Is the Department of Defense in any way involved in the presentations or in the legislation?
I can take a stab. You want to? We all may have a few things. Good question. I alluded to it with my comment on the President's Commander-in-Chief at the beginning, but then didn't elaborate at all. DOD has had some roles in sort of kind of the broader question of religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy in a few interesting ways. For one, you know, if you look at kind of the foreign assistance budget, the Defense Department has a tremendous amount of financial resources at its disposal. And in their kind of long war counterterrorism shop, they're actually doing some interesting programming supporting, you know, peaceful Muslim reformers in certain countries as kind of a religious freedom question. So there's been, insofar as they're kind of expanding their own strategic horizons for the ideological nature of the war on terror, there are some, like I said, oblique religious freedom principles being implemented there. Another sort of interesting angle that's a little delicate to talk about, but Bob, you may have some comments on this as well, is looking at countries that have been taken off the CPC list, ones that were initially designated as a country of particular concern and then later came off. Afghanistan was taken off the list in 2002 after the U.S. bombing campaign toppled the Taliban government. And I was with Ambassador Hanford at his press conference announcing in 2002 that Afghanistan was being taken off, and some cheeky French reporter, you know, had the question, oh, so is the only way to come off the list to get bombed? You know, and there's sort of uncomfortable, you know, grimacing. Well, in 2003, Iraq was taken off the CPC list after being, again, after the U.S. military campaign toppling the Saddam Hussein regime. That's not the sort of precedent that we would like to be setting, obviously. And fortunately, more recently, Vietnam was taken off the list after some, you know, peaceful diplomacy and sort of can have a combination of carrots and sticks, but none of them involving the coercive use of force. At the same time, going back to my comments at the beginning about religious freedom violations, religious persecution often being connected with security threats, that also was the case, again, with Afghanistan and with Iraq. So that's why these issues are fairly related. Bob, was Serbia ever a CPC? Yeah. Okay, well, another one that came off the list after a bombing campaign. So.
But they weren't countries.
Yeah.
It was Milosevic's portion of Rump Yugoslavia. It was the Taliban in Afghanistan. It wasn't a country.
Yeah, regimes of.
Right. So I think there's a difference. Now you can say, well, Iraq maybe might prove that point. First of all, we spent a lot of time talking about chaplains because we felt it would be important for chaplains who have these discussions all the time with the troops under them, should know exactly where the United States stands, what it's trying to do, and so on. And I would say that the military, by and large, if you look at the military compared to every single entity in the in the process, in this Washington think tank kind of environment, the military gets it better than anybody, understands it better than anybody. I mean, you may go into Congress and they don't know what a difference between a Sunni and a Shia is, but you bet that the commanders in the field do, because they have to. So I always found the military further ahead on human rights issues, especially as they're trying to teach the culture of a country that they're going to be thrown up against in combat situations, better than anybody else. I mean, I think the military could put some of our State Department folks to shame, for example, or other folks in that food chain that exists when we're supposed to have an integrated foreign policy. So I'd give the military high marks. I think there's still an awful lot that can be done with the chaplains. As you might imagine, the chaplains report to people as well, and they normally had a full agenda by the time they got to me. But I always had an audience when I went to talk to the chaplains. They wanted to hear this. They wanted to be helpful.
We had, just very briefly, and here I get to tell my anecdote. Shortly after the U.S. Military action in Afghanistan, we went in to talk to some senior State Department officials about the importance of promoting religious freedom in the new political context there. And we made our whole spiel, and then we got to the end, and this person, who will remain nameless, turned and said, well, I understand everything that you're saying, but let me ask you one question. Afghanistan, it's almost 100% Muslim, so what's the religious freedom angle? I mean, what's the religious freedom problem potentially there? So I think that the military on the ground does have to deal with religion constantly in those environments, and I'm no expert in assessing how that's done. It's encouraging what Bob has said, but that's extremely important. And as U.S. military is going to be engaged around the world, it's very important that they understand what's going on and to take decisions keeping that in mind.
Let me just add one comment there. I was speaking at the first ever Religious Cultural Awareness Training Program for Air Force chaplains last week at Air University at Maxwell, and also did a pilot program down at Fort Bragg for our Special Forces folks and Civil Affairs folks. I would echo what my father said in the sense that the military gets it because they have to. They're engaging the world as it is on the front line of foreign policy in some of these conflict zones. So they adjust from the corporal to the captain at the checkpoint. They have to know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. But this is still a very difficult thing to engage and intentionally educate and train for. By very nature of the fact that these pilot programs these last 2 years, we don't know what to do. General Petraeus has said his chaplains will be the point of religious cultural liaison in Baghdad. That is still not joint doctrine, and the chaplains are pushing back because they care for the spiritual welfare of the troops. But the question is, if not them, who? Just like if there's no other place in the State Department to think about religious freedom as a function of counterterrorism, it goes to the IRF office. And they're pretty busy. So this thing about religion and culture in our foreign policy is a much bigger issue that has to be thought about more comprehensively. And I would also argue that the international relations schools, whether it's Fletcher or Georgetown or SAIS, need to think about it very carefully. And that, of course, is how Tom Farr came to be here through Luce. Next question, ma'am.
Religious freedom? For one thing, it echoes the UN instruments better.
Yes. Did we not? Did you catch us there?
Well, just the general discussion that I've heard, I admit I haven't heard all of it, and the publicity for the event just uses the shorthand religious freedom.
And I think in all
realize it's an easier
Yeah,
term to use.
but in all the international documents, you're absolutely right. The freedom to believe or not, and the freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, all those terms get used as a collective. Nobody's left out. And I've always felt it's easier to talk with everybody in the circle than with groups outside the circle.
I can tell you it takes 3 hours on a rainy day to get from Harper's Ferry here, so I apologize for being late. I just want to advise you, first of all, Chris and Bill and Bob and Tad, as I walked in, Tad, on your comments, you said the best way is to work incrementally. And I'm brought some material with me this fall, October 6 to 12. We will be hosting some 1,500 lawyers, judges, law professors from 120-some countries here in Washington, D.C. They will focus not just on religious freedom, although we have a global task force on that, but conflict resolution, on family and community, on legal aid, and culture of life, and the rule of law and integrity. And I brought some literature with us. The way we work at Advocates International is incrementally. Since 1991, we encourage lawyers to meet locally. That's the L. To organize nationally. That's the O. In 1991, there were only 2 countries in the world that had proactive law groups, Christian law groups, if you will, and that was Canada and the U.S. Today, we have some 106 nationally organized groups that focus on these issues. R is the regional networks. Advocates Africa has some 42 nations. Advocates Asia, some 35, and Europe the same. And these work together on these issues. Again, not just religious freedom, but the broader spectrum. And then D is disciple, mentor, globally, and that's what we plan to do every 4 years, and we're doing this fall. If you want to know what we do, I have a small staff, 2 secretaries and myself, but the way we work is to work with the local lawyers and advocates, because it's our belief that those who have the licenses, the languages, the culture, and access have the greatest commitment, and they don't, that's not to take anything away from Washington, but if I have a problem in Pakistan, the area code is not 202, but an email to our lawyers in Pakistan. So just some information for you to know what Advocates International is doing. I applaud Bob, Chris, Bill, and Tad. You've fought the battle, walked the walk for a long time, and there is fruit.
Thank you, Sam. Rana.
Rana Sue Inboden, former State Department. I'd be curious in hearing your assessments of how the human rights organizations that traditionally do advocacy, such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, have responded on religious freedom. And then on the other group that can be helpful, the democracy building organizations, such as IRI and NDI, and also what each of your organizations have done to engage those groups and encourage them to do more. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had an exit interview when I left with Tom Pickering, and Tom asked me questions about implementation and what we took into account at point of implementation. And we had a pretty good discussion, but somewhere in the middle of it, he turned, he says, this is what I really have a problem with human rights folks. In principle, they have every principle. They have every moral imperative down pat, but they don't know how the world works. So they're constantly beating the chest without a sense of the problems, the commonsensical problems, the on-the-ground realities at points of implementation. I think that's the biggest problem for human rights advocacy groups. It's easy to stand up and take a position, especially in this country. It's easy to articulate what's wrong. It's a whole lot harder to implement. Why has it taken us so long with so few examples of national interest and national values being one and the same? Why does it always seem that one seems to be lagging? It's because we've had the fire and brimstone. We've had the speeches, but the implementation is sometimes wanting. And I think that we could use a little bit more humility on the part of human rights advocate groups in general, and a little more appreciation to the shrewdness. You know, we use a biblical phrase in a New Testament phrase, be as innocent as doves and shrewd as snakes. Human rights community tends to be innocent as doves, but the practicalities, the realities, the common sense is many times found wanting. That's a problem.
I'm not speaking in my capacity at Human Rights First, so I'm not going to take up the challenge, but all human rights groups are not created equal on that score. I think that the democracy promotion side of things is an interesting concept because you don't necessarily see a lot of cooperation between groups that are concerned about human rights and those that are concerned about promoting democracy. Religious freedom should be an avenue of of both of them. And I know that the Commission tried to engage with both IRI and NDI at various points on different subjects. And I think the lack of any sort of common, language that people could really be speaking was an impediment to that. So that's something that really is an important aspect. I think also humanitarian groups have an extremely important role to play, and yet there's really no common language there as well between human rights groups and them.
Will, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment picking up on Tad's, which is that just as the State Department, I think, has been very uneven in its approach to religious freedom, likewise, a lot of the mainstream human rights groups and democracy groups. I mean, sometimes you'll find a particular person or even a particular organization that it is very sophisticated and really kind of gets it on religious freedom as being, a very significant human right and to be integrated. Others have more indifference or even sometimes skepticism to the issue. Likewise with a lot of the democracy promotion groups. So just as religious freedom has some challenges to be further integrated into U.S. government policy, it also has some challenges to be more integrated with the broader human rights and democracy and NGO community. And there's fault on both sides there. Some of the religious freedom groups, I mean, I think we'd all say that we could have been doing more outreach there as well. So,
Rabbi Saperstein.
David Saperstein. A couple of quick assessments on connected things. In the first generation, Will, of the commission, it saw its mandate to advise the President and Secretary of State as requiring face-to-face meetings, which took place. I don't know, Tad, Will, whether those continued over the next years, and if so, how important you felt those were. And if they didn't, what it signified. Relatedly, in the first generation, I think we thought that there was a real benefit from the report over and above the substance by the very act of requiring, in any given year, 180 Foreign Service officers at each of the embassies to research the issue, make connections with the religious community, with the government officials there dealing with the issues, forcing the system at the regional level to assess the drafts of the report and edit them as it moved up the system. And that over the years, there's 180 and 180 and 180. It's a lot of people get involved. Hasn't had an impact on the Foreign Service Corps, as was our sense of it at the very beginning. And finally, connected with that, if there was one failure in the first generation, it was anticipated we would engage with the Foreign Service Institute to really work with them, and we really didn't do a good job. I think the office at the State Department did a better job on that, but I'd be curious 10 years out about your assessment about the training, both for incoming officers and at the retraining for DCMs and ambassadors.
I'll just give real quick responses there. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Rabbi Saperstein was the first chair of USERF and did a tremendous job to really kind of get it on the map and launched off to a good start. I'm pretty sure that the commissioners met with President Bush at least a couple times. 2 times, yeah. And I'm not sure about the Secretary of State.
It met with both Secretary Paul and Secretary Rice once each. So it was not as much as the commission would have liked, but it did happen.
Yeah, okay, so fair to middle in there. My sense from when I was at State is that the very mandate to do the annual religious freedom report, however, grudgingly sometimes carried out by Foreign Service officers was a great help. Just the very process of having to go out and meet with the different religious communities and NGOs and kind of get their assessments. And often, just anecdotally in my travels with State to different embassies, I'd hear from, some FSOs saying, wow, this was, really illuminating for us and we're a lot more mobilized on this issue now. You'd also find just as many kind of, wailing and gnashing in their teeth and rending their garments over yet another report to do. And I don't want to be trivial about that. Those folks are so so overburdened, and it seems like every year the Hill is, thwacking them with yet another reporting mandate. So it's a hard balance. On engagement with FSI, again, I'd give us maybe a B- there. Tom Farr had gotten off to a good start of kind of regular lectures to the A100 class over at FSI to train the new Foreign Service officers, which I had then inherited that mantle and would lecture there regularly. But it was just sort of kind of 1 hour out of a 6-week course, and that's a lot of religion to try to throw at them in just an hour. I'm not sure if that's continued or not. So, you guys may have.
Just on the FSI point, the commission has also started to take advantage of its hour at FSI in the A100 class. I think it's very mixed. Some people are getting it more and more among the younger Foreign Service officers, but it still tends to be the most junior person out there that's really spending the most time doing the sorts of things that you said, and that's important, and maybe over time we'll still see more growth in that. But I think that the engagement of the DCMs and the ambassadors and the increasing their facility to address religious questions in the countries that they're serving is a real challenge, and something that I haven't yet seen the State Department quite step up to in that regard.
We'll take three questions and then wrap up. Please make them concise. Steve, here in this row. Joe.
Will, do you agree with Ambassador Seipel's pretty categorical statement that there isn't a constructive role for sanctions? And as a subpart of that question, if there is, can you give an example? And is there a role for the Commission to be the bad cop, whereas you at least to have the threat of sanctions and giving the State Department the good cop role?
We'll take all three questions.
Oh, okay. Ambassador Seiple, I'm curious about how the necessary lessons regarding diplomacy that can be learned from the case of Laos could be applied to countries with even more systematic violations of religious freedom. Even though it might be a shrewd diplomatic move to be playing golf with Kim Jong-il, I doubt as though that kind of action would pass any sort of moral muster.
Yeah, we'd go to the ballet together.
Oh, excellent. And a separate but related question, which is quite similar to the gentleman's behind me, would be, for those countries that are a party to international rights treaties, is there a difference between a punishment versus an enforcement mechanism?
Joe Lacani with Pepperdine University. Real quickly, the decision to designate Saudi Arabia as a country of particular concern, can you tell us what influence that really had then on the ground? Did it embolden reformers? Did it change the situation on the ground in terms of religious liberty in Saudi Arabia? And then relatedly, can you think of where the Commission has had some real significant impact on Middle East and religious liberty in any Mideast country over the last 10 years, where you really are seeing movement in the right direction?
Thank you. Let's work left to right. Will?
Okay, taking them briefly, thanks for the question, Steve. Yeah, with all tremendous respect and affection for Bob, I would differ with him on his assessment of sanctions and the punitive role. Again, I mean, it's a nuanced, complicated question. You need all the tools available in your kit, and sometimes the efficacy of diplomacy is going to be enhanced when the threat or implementation of sanctions is actually there. And I'll just rattle off a few examples. One actually would be Laos. The very fact that they had not received PNTR was a sanction. And that had been, it goes back to the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and non-market economies that don't allow free immigration can't get normal trade relations with the U.S. But, and again, nobody on planet Earth has done more than Bob Seiple to advance religious freedom in Laos. But I would submit that the incentive that the Lao government had to get off the PNTR list, and I'd negotiated with them some on that as well, was one of the motivators for them to improve their religious freedom practices. Sudan, another one. Several Sudanese officials have told me personally and others that the pretty severe sanctions put on them for a number of years because of the North-South conflict were effective in driving them to the negotiating table. South Africa under apartheid, a classic case. Those are more effective sanctions because they were multilateral. And you know, again, for every example I can give you of sanctions maybe working, I'll give you 3 where they didn't. So I'm not an unreconstructed apologist for sanction. I'm just saying it's a toolkit thing. Another more recent one, not on a human rights case, but with North Korea and the Banco Delta Asia targeted sanction. This is where it's not a blunt instrument at all. It's kind of a rifle shot that caught at Kim Jong-il and his family's ill-gotten gains. And that caused tremendous pain for them and kind of drove them right back to the negotiating table. And then Vietnam. When Vietnam was designated a country of particular concern, that in itself is sort of kind of a sanction of opprobrium. The financial measures were not implemented. They were sort of waived to give Vietnam another year to negotiate, and that was sort of a helpful negotiating stick, and they made a number of improvements and came off the list. So let's see. Saudi CPC, I'm not up to speed on the latest, Joe, so talk to someone in the IRF office on that. I think it did help maybe raise up the level of some of the quiet behind-the-scenes diplomacy with the Saudis, particularly on allowing greater latitude for private non-Muslim worship, as well as for them starting to take some steps to improve some of the slander in their textbook. There's more to be done there, but I'm kind of a couple years removed from the guts of that one. So.
On the punishment thing that everybody is saying with all due respect, I feel the short hairs of the back of my neck go up when people begin with all due respect.
My friend, yeah.
Frankly, I don't think I absolutize that principle. What I would absolutize, however, is that promotion works better than punishment. And I'll stick to that. Yeah, there are times when you hold out carrots and you hold out sticks, and you need to be judicious. But I would not say absolutely that you never use punishment. I just think we have to be a whole lot more judicious. And when we lead the world in bilateral, unilateral sanctions, which are the most difficult to implement, they become toothless. And so you create a bad taste but no real hurt. And we've just got all kinds of examples of that. In terms of the principles that worked in Laos, that's what they were. Laos was my example, but the principles hopefully are the takeaways. And yes, golf might be replaced with ballet, depending on the figure. We may not have a Saudi day down on the water, but the underlying concepts that we were trying to create, how do we get people to really trust us, where they will tell us what they're thinking, and they will tell us what the problems are, and they will tell us how hard they're working to do things that we think ought to be done yesterday, but they don't even have fax machines going to the district offices. I can tell you this, and this is all anecdotal, and you can take it for what it's worth, but when you first start going to a country and you're only met by a lower level person from the U.S. Embassy, you keep going back, and then finally they meet you with someone from the Lao government and the U.S. Embassy. You keep going back, and then they meet you with flowers and take your pictures, and there's an article in the Vientiane Times. And you finally know you've arrived when they come to say goodbye to you with pictures of their grandchildren. Now, that's all anecdotal. That'll change from country to country. But basically what you're trying to do is get to a relationship. And this is not saying, hey, anything you say is right and everything I say is wrong. I apologize for being an American, all that kind of stuff. No, that doesn't create trust at all. That's just kind of a hollow form of sentimentality. So the examples will change, but the principles of long-term engagement, relational diplomacy, where they see you coming back and back and back. I have never been introduced in Laos without the person telling the crowd what visit it was. This is his 12th time back. This is his 13th time back. His family comes with him. It's important to them. And find out what's important to them and build on it. And I think we'll advance this issue a lot faster.
The last word, Ted?
The last word. I would agree with Will, I think, on the sanctions point. I think that it can have an impact. I won't tell you what he just mumbled over here next to me. You know, I look at the Sudan example where the House passed a version of the Sudan Peace Act that included sanctions for companies doing business in Sudanese oil and gas, preventing them from access to U.S. capital markets. Now, whether or not this would have ever come to pass is highly doubtful, but the mere fact that it was introduced in the Congress, this was a recommendation of the Commission, the mere fact that it was introduced did change the dynamic at the negotiating table, which again is still a step removed from what's actually happening on the ground, but it was one of the incentives for the Sudanese government to be engaged. I think that the Vietnam case is also one where they're looking for something. Out of the United States, permanent normal trade relations. They're looking over their back against more bad publicity, which is really what the sanction encourages. But it's it has diminishing returns over time, and my view is that it can't be the preeminent tool in the kit. It's got to be something that's there, but the approach cannot be one of we're promoting religious freedom by holding over the threat of sanctions. It has to be a much more nuanced approach along the lines of what really gets at promoting things on the ground. Whether or not the Commission could play a bad cop role, I think also depends. It's done that in a couple of cases, but it's probably not appropriate in other cases. On the Saudi, have there been change? Well, there's been tiny amounts of change. There was a flurry of diplomatic engagement over the issue following the CPC designation. It established the possibility that things could get better over time in a number of very particular and specific areas, and I know that Ambassador Hanford has pursued those particular areas, but they're not yet bearing much fruit, at least by the time I left the Commission at the end of the end of the year. And I think it's difficult in all of the countries of the Middle East, frankly. Given the war in Iraq and the Middle East peace, the Israel-Palestine issue, it's extremely difficult, to have an impact. But interestingly, Egypt is an example of where you might have an unexpected possibility to make some change. And actually, in the period right after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there was a tremendous amount of hope in Egypt that act, as well as the administration's intention to promote democracy in the Middle East, was going to, what was helpful for people who are seeking change in Egypt on a variety of fronts, and including on religious freedom. So it opened up this small window, perhaps unexpectedly, and from my point of view, there really wasn't the resources there, to follow up on that. And the policy, inevitably has to begin to readjust, given the difficulties on the ground in that region. So it's a tremendous challenge, and can't point to all that much, I don't think, yet, in that regard.
Please join me in promoting, celebrating, and thanking this panel.